Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining our October webinar. It's 12 o'clock, and as promised, we are going to start promptly. Today we're talking about a very timely topic, resilience. What does that mean in this changing environment, in this dynamic context, and who's involved and what's happening on this front? Before we get started, I want to thank our sponsor, the LA Department of Water and Power, as always, for their support of this educational content. A few housekeeping items. As always, we will be recording this and sending out the slides with key takeaways by Friday. We will keep the attendee lines muted to keep things orderly, but please do submit your questions via the chat box, and we've earmarked plenty of time at the end to go over Q&A, and please do take advantage of that. We've got two real experts on the line today. And as always, tell us how we did. We always want to do better. What did you love, and how can we continue to improve? I'm Dave Hodgins. I run the LA Better Buildings Challenge, and as I said, we have some rock star speakers today. Dan Winters, who's been on our webinars, participated before, head of the Americas for GRESB, which for those of you who don't know is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. I will leave it to him to tell you more about what that is, but he brings a global perspective to this issue, and we'll be bringing it down to the local context as well. Danielle Horton is founder and president of Verdani Partners, and she's working directly with large portfolios that are grappling with these issues, and is going to bring that practitioner's perspective, and it's going to be a great dialogue really between the two of them. So looking forward to that. A little context, it's in the zeitgeist now, it's in the news, climate, but climate is creating new risks, and we don't even know what all those are. I think that's my takeaway, trying to follow the science, is the only thing the models have been right about is that it's happening faster and weirder than we think. So we need to get ready. I won't belabor this. I think everybody's familiar, but here's some data in case it's helpful. It's getting hotter, drier. Fires are becoming more frequent. I hope that everybody is doing okay with these the Getty fires here. I'm hearing from a lot of my friends and colleagues, and it's disturbing. This is, but unfortunately, this is a new normal, and we're using drinking water to fight fires. So think about that. Next, please. PG&E just did their first voluntary shutoff of almost 2 million people. The good thing is they may have avoided another huge multi-billion-dollar and loss of lives fire. There were about 50 transformers that could have sparked. The brush index right now is over 300. Mayor Garcetti said yesterday, which is double the safe levels. So interesting, avoiding fires, causing a blackout, people are upset. Fire happens, obviously, not good either. Still get the blackout. So this is a new context that we're trying to operate within. How are we grappling with this? So I think this is just a synopsis, and we'll get over to the meat of the conversation here today. But with this happening everywhere, how does this come home locally to LA, and what are some forward-thinking measures that we can take today to get ready for this?
All right. Well, David, is that my cue? No, go ahead.
That is your cue, Dan. That is your
All
cue.
Right,
Take
great.
it away.
All right. Well, David, thanks so much. And thanks so much for having me. This is Dan Winters, head of Americas with GRESB. I'm dialing in here from the Washington, D.C. Suburbs in Arlington, Virginia, and wanted to talk a little bit about resilience. And so my remarks are going to lead off just to ground us in what GRESB is and how we got here and what we do for the capital markets. And then Danielle Horton and I will have a conversation about resiliency, because that's really the key theme here. We have a module that we put forward, so I'll give you a little detail about that. And I'm really confident this is going to be a great time spent by everybody. So what is GRESB? Dave, you introduced it greatly with the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. We also do infrastructure, so therefore we've just kind of condensed and go by GRESB. At the core, what we do is we assess and we benchmark. And we do this at the portfolio level. A portfolio is either a company or a private equity fund that owns multiple assets. And we offer standardized and validated data to the capital markets. What this looks like is the folks on the left. That is, say, CalPERS, CalSTRS, UC Regents, LA Police and Fire. Those are the institutional investors that are putting money out to fund managers and oftentimes investing in public companies to give them capital and in return get a return on that capital. So we've got the fund managers and listed companies on the right. They're the ones that participate in our assessment on an annual basis. And GRESB is kind of in the middle. We're a communication platform between the two. Conceptually, here's really how to think about market behavior. And we see this with the green building labels. You've got on the left-hand side of this bell curve, you've got regulation. That's the law. Everyone needs to follow it. And buildings that manifests in code. On the right-hand side, we know that people do more things besides just following and building a code building. And so what does leadership look like? Well, that idea came about 20 years ago when the building labels came about, when Energy Star was launched to the marketplace, and it's become a global phenomenon. So not only do you have LEED, but you've got LEED Canada, you've got Green Star in Australia, there's BREEAM in the EU, and Neighbors is the equivalent of Energy Star in Australia. So these labels are what I call economic signaling that happen to demonstrate, hey, there's more happening at this building than a normal code building. So this became apparent to a number of institutional investors. The three that are circled here are our founding members, APG, PGGM. These are two very, very large Dutch pension plans, and then USS out of the UK. And so those were the original three back in 2009 that said to themselves, hey, sustainability is a thing. We're getting a lot of fund managers that are sending us, our annual reports that have LEED buildings or BREEAM buildings. What are all of our other fund managers doing when it comes to this? That fundamental question 10 years on has led to GRESB, and it's attracted a whole group of other institutional investors. So we've got over 100 that subscribe to our data. And here's kind of conceptually how to think about that, is we've got asset owners. Those are the people, the logos on the prior slide. And they use GRESB with their global REITs, their private equity positions, to really understand what's happening and get, insights and data where data didn't exist before. And basically GRESB has prompted this data flow from the asset level through portfolios all the way up to the capital markets, where folks are now doing carbon footprinting. They're looking at risk in a different way. I like to say that we work in structured, non-financial data that goes to inform how the financials came about. So going back to the distribution curve, we rate companies that participate in GRESB because GRESB is voluntary. Not everybody participates. We don't give a rating to everybody, only those that will submit by July 1st. So we, in a similar fashion, will deliver scores from a 1 to 5 star based upon how folks did. 5 stars great, right? That's the leader of the pack. That's the top 20% of the GRESB universe. And the folks that are down on 1 star, they're doing great too. They're really starting to think about these issues and working to put together plans and programs to climb the ladder and hopefully get up to 5-star status. So we've been at this for 10 years. And some metrics to sort of think about. I talked about APG, PGGM, and USS, right? Those 3 institutional investors have grown to over 100. So we've got 10 years, we've got 100 institutional investors. This year, we took in over 1,000 submissions on the real estate assessment. I emphasized before that GRESB is voluntary, so nobody really rolls out of bed to do this GRESB assessment. But more and more often, we have LPs that ask their general partners to participate, but we also see great interest bubbling up to the top from those that are curious, those that want to have an ESG policy, a program. And honestly, it's folks, most firms have a lot of good things that are happening on a sustainability standpoint, but it's not organized. And once you start to do things like benchmarking through GRESB, you are able to learn and corral things that are happening within your broader portfolio, hopefully transfer some best practices from buildings or regions to another. And that's why the 1,000 folks keep showing up year after year after year. And those 1,000 The submissions this year covered 100,000 different buildings in 60 odd countries across the globe. So you can see from the left-hand side how that's grown to be where we are on the right-hand side. Here's what that looks like from a participation level standpoint. The top green line shows that back in 2010, we had roughly 200 participants. And this year, year on year, we continue to grow. And so now we've got over 1,000. The sublines below it show that roughly half of those participants come from Europe, a quarter of them come from North America, and the remaining quarter come from the Australia-Asian region. Scores on average over time have climbed. You'll see the reset between 2013 and 2014. And since then, we've got 6 solid years where we have a very stable assessment, and the market continues to get better. So with this climb, you can see the clustering happening in the upper right, right? It's hard to become a 5-star GRESB company. You've got basically a score in the 80s. And 4-star is super competitive. There's only 6 points on the GRESB assessment that separate a 5, that 4-star cohort, right? From a 5 to a 3, the difference is 6 or maybe 7 points. Listed typically outperforms private. Private made a good jump this year, so they're pretty close. Listed companies are a little bit more transparent, have more management policies and procedures in place. So that's been a typical phenomena. The way to interpret this graphic, last comment here, is on the left-hand side, that left axis is management and policy. That counts for about 27% of the GRESB score. And the harder part is being able to implement and actually get data and measure how you're doing year on year. So that accounts for a little over 75% of the GRESB score. And the typical trajectory is up and to the right. So a company gets their GRESB score the first time, it might not be so great. And they're like, okay, I see, we need to have some policies, some procedures, some real management things happening. So their score shoots up, and then it starts to go to the right as more implementation and measurement happens. This bubble or this area chart sort of shows it shows the distribution between 2009, which is the light green on the left-hand side. So you see a lot of folks were packed on the lower left side of the scores, with a long tail to the right, showing folks participants that were doing a great job and showing leadership within the industry. Well, that's flipped. And so now we've got a big bulk on the upper right where companies and participants are doing a great job, and we've got some new entrants on the left that are just getting started. So it's been a very interesting shift. How is our data used? So these logos are institutional investors. There's 5 different ways that companies and analysts at these firms typically use our data. The first is engagement, right? Where they ask I'll say 3 different questions. Did you participate in GRESB last year? What'd you think? And that is a simple question meant to start peeling the onion. What did you think means, well, tell us about procedures, action plans that you have, say an LED lighting retrofit that's being rolled out writ large on the portfolio. And then the key money question is, what are you doing to get better? How are you driving down risk? How are you increasing return? That's what that conversation is all about. The next one is ESG integration, which is using this, and this group are particularly prone to the listed property company sector, stock pickers, active traders. And so they're incorporating ESG data as one of, say, 6 or 8 different attributes that they'll think about with a company and how they want to inform their investment process. The third group, Northern Trust, they have a product. And that product basically has 2 hurdles. The first hurdle is, did a listed property company participate in the GRESB assessment? That lops off an investable universe of roughly 400 companies globally down to the 220 that participated last year. Second hurdle, did you get 2 stars? Did you achieve 2 stars or higher on the GRESB rating system? That winnows the investable universe down to about 170 companies. And from there, they use their active stock management picking processes to formulate a portfolio. So that's what I call a positive screen, best in class, right? 2 stars or higher having participated in GRESB. The last one I'll point out is number 5, the portfolio tilt. We have an index that's out in the marketplace with S&P. And what they do is they put a little bit more allocation to companies that do well at GRESB. Every real estate company that's in the base real estate index remains in the green index. but the ones that do well at GRESB get a little bit more shares allocated to them to reward them for best practices on sustainability and risk management. So the investment spectrum is changing, right? The traditional side is in the gray box on the left. We want competitive returns, that's it, we don't care how you get there. And there's limited or honestly sometimes no regard for these other risk management practices. And that conversation in the marketplace has changed. And so now it's really shrunk to the focus on these three segments, the new paradigm. Is it responsible? Is it sustainable? And is there some impact, right? So it's, yes, I want returns, and it's not but, it's and, right? And it's all about mitigating risk, pursuing opportunities within that portfolio, and being able to elevate metrics that can tie to certain, impact things that are beneficial to, society, to the country, to the company. Okay, so I want to shift gears now and talk about the resilience module. GRESB has its standard questions that we've had out there for the past 6 years. When new ideas bubble to the top and are introduced, they come by the way of a module. 4 years ago, we had the health and well-being module, and then 2 years ago, we launched the resilience module. So my comments here are going to be focused on that. It's a supplement to the real estate and infrastructure assessments, and it has new indicators. So it's basically 10 questions that as soon as a participant is completed with their GRESB assessment, there's an option. Would you like to participate in the resilience module? And if so, please go and answer these questions. And the idea with the module is year one is about finding out what's happening in the industry. Are people interested? Will people actually fill this out? And it's almost self-selective. You have a self-selective group of participants in GRESB as it is, and then typically it's those that either have resilience or know that it's a topic or are go-getters and want to do it. Every once in a while we have people that are like, oh, wow, there's 10 more questions, let's just do these things as well. So we do get a good cross-section of the industry, and what we're trying to get at are these 4 bullet points here. Leadership and governance. Is somebody in charge? Does the buck stop with somebody that has clout and budget? Is there, what do the risk management practices look like? Is it incorporated in the business strategy? And can you measure performance? So when you think about what a resilience organization looks like, I want to offer these 7 different criteria, right? Is there qualified and accountable leadership, typically a senior executive? And we've seen in our results that it's kind of split 50-50. You've got the sustainability professional within a private equity firm or a listed property company who's in charge. And with the other half of the responses, you actually have a super senior. And sometimes the sustainability person is a very senior person. Think about Sarah Neff at Kilroy, right? SVP, has been there for a long time, doing a great job with her firm, right? So then, is there a clearly defined and empowered internal team to actually implement on the ground and get things done? Have you tested these external partnerships? Because it requires not just the company, but other service providers to really execute in times of shocks and stressors to the portfolio. Is the risk management or the assessment, is it relevant? And is it consistently applied across a portfolio? Talked about business strategy and the alignment there. And the last one is, can you measure performance and do it on a timely basis? Those are the drivers of what a good, resilient organization or an organization that's embraced resiliency. That's some attributes. So I talked about the kind of split. So 90% of the participants have said yes. There is somebody senior responsible for it. Half of them come from the sustainability section of the company, and another half are other senior executives. And 90% of the participants also report some level of asset level assessment on these physical and environmental stressors. The top 2 on this list sort of kind of feel like business as usual, right? If you've got to do a property condition assessment report, if you're doing a phase 1 environmental assessment, those are reflexive yeses. You start moving down the list here and you see things like technological shocks, geophysical events, meteorological, economic stressors. These are new and emerging things. It's leadership. And we're seeing when we surveyed the industry, these are the results that we're getting. So resiliency is a thing. Folks are taking action. Here's what those results look like from the lens of our module. If you want to find out more information, there's a report that's based upon the 2018 data. that's on our website. The link is at the bottom. And the 2019 report is in process, and we are targeting towards the end of the year. So with it, I mentioned that this is a 3-year cycle. So this was our 2nd year. The advancements that we took once we gathered that the industry are doing things on resilience is to align this with the TCFD. And that TCFD stands for the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And that's something that's bubbling up in Europe. There's a lot of momentum behind it. And so the resilience module is aligned very closely with the TCFD recommendations. We also separated risks: transition risk, physical risk, things that are social disruptors. You can map the questions to that. And then we asked for reporting on scenario analysis. Do companies actually, undertake a scenario analysis? Maybe Danielle will be able to talk about that a little bit. And the data that's come in this year, we had 316 companies through, I guess that was last year in 2018. And the number grew again this year, the number of participants over 400 in the resilience module. On the left-hand side of this graphic, you'll see 4 TCFD categories. And this is the mapping and how the questions and the resilience module map to that. So you see metrics and targets, risk management, strategy, and governance. And there's the percentage of how they mapped. This is a histogram from 2019 of those results. And so the participants on the left are the ones that scored the highest, right? Where they were saying that they do 100% of the things within the resilience module. And you see how that starts to tail off to the right. So this kind of looks like a normal distribution from activity out in the marketplace, with risk management being something that people focus in on very closely, and strategy alignment's a little bit harder, right? Governance is typically strong, but does tail off towards the end. So with that, I want to stop my comments. That's the introduction of the resilience module. And I want to bring Danielle Horton into the conversation here, because Danielle is she's been a GRES Premier Partner. Her firm has been a GRES Premier Partner for a long time. And she works with some of the leading companies that are GRES participants, including one that achieved sector leadership this year. So Danielle, are you with us? How are you?
Hi, yeah, thank you, Dan. That was very insightful.
Awesome.
I think today it's hard to talk about sustainability without addressing resiliency. It's becoming, I think, if not like one of the most important factors as we see a lot that's happening in the industry. There's more and more attention from real estate portfolios on kind of like real estate. And just to put in context, so you know where I'm coming from, Verdani Partners, we work with a lot of real estate portfolios. We're currently managing about 4,300 properties nationally and internationally. And I'll talk more about the experiences that we are having implementing those resiliency strategies with our clients.
Perfect.
Dan,
yeah, so I'm sorry. Was there more?
Oh, yeah. I think the only other thing I was going to add is that, yeah, and we've been very fortunate that, like last year, one of our clients was ranked number one globally in resiliency on the NeoGRES resiliency module. And this year again, and we've had several clients that ranked really well on the resiliency module, which I think is a really good validation to the strategies that we have been implementing with those portfolios. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, well, no, that's exactly why you and I are going to have this conversation. And I'm eager to see your slides. I haven't seen them yet. I know that we added them from last night. All right, well, tell us about Moody's. Tell us what this is.
Sounds good. And I mean, I think we all know about, climate change and that what some of the causes. It's causing billions of dollars in damage. We've had over like $1.6 trillion in damages since the 1980s. And right now, like folks like Moody's Investors Reports, they're looking at even the overall GDP impacts of some of those climate risks, where they're forecasting even like could be as high as 3.5% of GDP, depending on the different risk scenarios. And we see that these, and as David mentioned, these events are becoming more frequent, and they're also becoming more costly. And I think an important thing in terms of a global impact is that Some of the more developing countries are kind of more a bigger part of the problem causing this, but some of the poor countries, especially South America, Africa, and across Asia, are the ones that are going to suffer more the impacts. We also know that buildings are about 40% responsible for 40% of carbon emissions, so they need to be a big part of the solution. And based on a recent meeting at the UN, basically we have about 10 years left to affect change to avoid more catastrophic consequences of climate change. You can go to the next one.
Well, it actually really manifests itself in the real estate and real asset sector because, it's immovable, it's going to be in a particular location, and it's subject to these risks. If you look at that graphic on the right, in GRES, we're a voluntary standard that gets folks to move forward and be a series of best practices. And I'm always talking about up and to the right, but geez, this is an up and to the right bad news scenario, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide.
Next slide.
Sure. Okay,
Sounds
so we've
good.
got this timeline. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so this is just to give an idea, there's a lot of different organizations popping out every year that are trying to address the effects of climate change, like in organizations like the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group or the U.S. Resiliency Council. We've had eco districts, the 100 resilient cities that was pioneered by the Rockefeller Center. They're basically trying to place resiliency officers on some of the major metropolitan cities on a global scale. We started performing risk assessment and addressing risks back in, it was around 2015. And, U.S. also created a U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. It was done by the previous administration with other or like with NOAA and other federal agencies. It's a great tool. It was currently kind of tucked away so that it wouldn't be dismantled by the current administration, but it's very insightful. Dan mentioned that, TCFD was released, that was back in 2015. We're also seeing even ratings and standards that are kind of trying to rank and do third-party validation for resiliency metrics like the RELI rating system. And we're seeing organizations like GRES that are trying to, this is becoming more and more important in the market, making sure that's incorporated in metrics like GRES that are looking at evaluating performance, ESG performance among real estate portfolios. And it's great to see that, from those results that a lot of the members are currently looking at some of the risks. And so there's more companies now trying to kind of fill that market void to help companies understand their risks, like companies like, 427. And it was interesting that some of their latest reports show that 40% of the, REITs, U.S. REITs would be impacted by risks like sea level rise. And, as Verdani partners, we're also continuing to deepen our kind of resilience and risk assessment tools and also creating potential apps that we wanted to be able to be free to the public so they can also understand risks that, could impact their homes, like share information with one another and make sure that we are prepared to deal with those bigger risks. Then awesome. You can go to the next slide.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about this for a second. So this resilience risk assessment tool, are you going to tell us a little bit more about that in a few minutes? Is that part of
the
Okay,
yeah,
great.
I have a slide that I'll go deeper on that.
Awesome. So then my other question is this U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, has this been squirreled away somewhere, like in Google Find It for us? Do you know, have you tried finding it?
No, you can. Yeah, if you go on Google, you can find it, and it's really insightful. It's very helpful. So I'm glad that they kind of just tucked away in a different website, but it's still available, and you can Google it, and it's very helpful.
The deep state at work for you. That's beautiful. All right, Danielle, this is a great timeline. Super job. Okay, so a resilience action plan. This is now getting down and with what you do with your clients, right?
Yes. Yeah, so basically, as we're dealing with large real estate portfolios or even cities or, this also applies for individual properties. How do you tackle this? How do you tackle resilience? What does a resiliency action plan look like? And, as a first step, it's really important to make sure you understand those risks. So our risk assessments, for example, we're looking at like 50 different indicators, both from regional level and building level. So like regional level are things like, sea level rise risks or other types of risks, whether, building level, you can look more like, do you have, backup power? There's different risks that we're looking at, and we're separating them around physical, social, and transition risks to align both with GRESB and things like TCFD. So it's really important to make sure that we understand those risks. We're also doing scenario planning on those risks, because depending on our global actions to kind of reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and limit temperature increase, there's different scenarios. So we are aligning with like IPCC scenarios and looking at different levels of sea level rise depending on kind of what happens. So it's important to take a lot of those things in consideration. And the interesting part is that some of the risks that were predicted like to only happen like 7 years from now are happening now. So I think David mentioned that in the beginning. Things are happening much faster. So it's really important that we understand those risks. As a second step is to make a plan. So it's important to have a plan in place that allocates that, okay, if I have this risk, this is kind of what I can do to address it, and create like a framework to help our clients deal with those things. And that includes like setting goals and targets for resiliency, making sure that we're, that those policies or plans cover like protecting building site structure, system, operations, and people. And I'll talk a little more about kind of what that resiliency plan looks like. So you just have some guidance on how do those properties prepare once you know what the risks are, and then implement it. So I'll talk about a case study, but it's really important once you know those risks to take action. And some of the most basic things is even like, do you have an emergency preparedness plan at your building? And it's really surprising when we find out that most buildings actually don't have it in place. So, especially for large properties that sometimes have like 5,000 building occupants, you have to have one of those in place so you can communicate with your building occupants what to do in the case of a disaster. So not only making sure you have those plans in place to deal with potential risks that your property might face, but also making sure you have proper, that you're taking steps to implement things based on those risks, and also making sure you have proper insurance coverage. When we talk to our clients, they're like, they're like, yes, of course we have insurance. But when we look at it, no one wants to touch flood insurance. If you're in California, no one wants to touch fire insurance. That, you're not, a lot of those risks are not getting covered by insurance. So one of the things we hope too is once the properties identify risks and then they take measures to mitigate those risks, they can also negotiate lower insurance rates. And it's important that once you have those planning in place, that you're raising awareness and communicating with your building occupants what to do in the case of a disaster.
It's a pretty common, it's a pretty common phenomena within the GRESB assessment. There's a lot of companies that really don't have plans, an emergency level plan at the property level. And if you truly map out the insurance coverage, you find gaps. And proper risk management is to be able to identify those gaps and think about that from a portfolio level view. So doing this in a structured fashion yields tremendous benefits. Go ahead.
Right. So and some of the ways we are looking at those assessments, physical, social, and transition risks, like tools like Climate Central, anyone can go to those tools and put your building, and then you can toggle up and down to see different levels of risks based on different scenarios. So we create those like where we put the whole portfolio. Sometimes we're doing risk assessments for like 1,000 properties at once. So we do like those heat mapping where you can show like, easily see like kind of the properties with high risks. We're also trying to kind of map it out to show like where the high risk properties and the low risk properties are. And also create tools like the quadrant tool where you can say, okay, so most buildings of your portfolio are high risk or low risk, so that you can make sure to take action. And it's really interesting, like on the recent presentations, we do annual presentations for our clients, strategists communicating with stakeholders. This is always the one topic that gets so much attention, and it's like there's a lot of follow-up questions and things, because we typically show like, okay, this is a percentage of your portfolio that is impacted by X, Y, and Z risks, and that's always the one where like everybody is like freaking out about it or trying to understand more. So it's really important to make sure that we are doing those risk assessments.
They probably
Jen, you can go to the next slide.
Yeah, sure, I will. They probably didn't know. And what I really like about this is the separation between a building level risk and a regional risk. I think that's great. And obviously, if they're both combined, it's going to end up with high overall risk. And once you know, you measure what you manage. Well, no, but you measure. Maybe I said that backwards, but you know what I mean. If you measure what you measure, you improve, right? And so bringing and elevating topics is great. All right, let's talk about emergency planning.
It sounds good. So, like on our plans, what is some of the things that we like to see on a resiliency plan or even emergency planning? Obviously, is making sure that you have taking strategies to protect your building site, and we're also seeing some lessons learned. So, like flood proofing, and it's not just about on the building site level. Even if the building's not flooded, if you've been through a hurricane, we've had clients where their windows weren't properly sealed and a lot of moisture got into the buildings, and now they're dealing with all kinds of issues like mold. So it's really important, like the preventive metrics strategies are a lot less costly than actually dealing with the problem later. So making sure they're stabilizing slopes or erosion, and making sure that you have, proper infrastructure to prevent flooding as well. In terms of the building structure, it's really important to enhance structural elements. We see a lot of buildings collapsing depending on the types of risks. Our old building codes was just not kind of designed to the kinds of things that buildings are kind of facing right now. So it's really important to, make sure that we're enhancing building insulation and making sure that the structural codes the structural elements are able to withstand some of those new risks. On the system side, it's really important to look at your backup systems for like backup power, water, even food, making sure you have kind of your emergency systems in place. And one of the things, lessons learned there too, is that before, when you have a generator or a backup power system, you're looking at, 24 hours. But when you see like Puerto Rico or places that like were without power for like so long, you're now looking at those backup power systems being able to stay on for a much longer period of time, like even 2 weeks. There's also like how those backup systems are powered. Like we've had clients that they had a generator, but they were they couldn't get the streets were blocked, and they just couldn't get fuel to those generators when they were hit by a hurricane. So it's really important that you make the plan to make sure that even your backup power systems are going to work. And some of them are even looking at solar generators that are powered by solar. So there's a lot of solutions coming up when we're looking at buildings, and making sure that so for example, on the operations side that we talked about, having those emergency communication plans, so you're protecting records and inventory, that you're training the facility team members to not only do the facility upgrades, but to what to do in the case of a disaster. And it's also really important to locate vulnerable populations and plan for building occupant needs. Just one simple there, for example, one of our buildings in New York, it was a high rise, they had like years ago, they had like a 5-day blackout, and the janitorial staff, because they were dependent on public transportation and the metro system stopped, they were stranded on the building for 5 days. And at the time, they didn't have a place. Do you want to say something then?
No, I'm just agreeing with you. Right? These are things you don't even think about. Your plans have to be, multifaceted, without a doubt.
Right, and so like now they have a place, just one last point on that. They have a place like that people, if you have people that might get stranded on site? Do you have a place for them to sleep? So there's just a lot to think about it when you locate your vulnerable populations and have a place to address. And I just think a final point on this is that even sometimes if you say, okay, I'm just going to shut down my building, there's some building types, like if it's a supermarket, they are like a really important hub for the community, and it's important that those stay in operation because they're also critical for the community as a whole. So it's really, depending on the building type, important that they kind of stay operational in the case of disasters. We can go to the next one.
We've been lucky, sure. We've been lucky where we are, right? I live in Arlington, Virginia. We've had a couple big blizzards that have knocked out a whole bunch of stuff, but right across the street's a grocery store, and that stayed open. I was really grateful to see that. All right, what do we have here?
Yeah.
Oh, one of your clients.
Yes. Yeah. So we based on that plan, we have a case study that we think it's we like to share. So this is a Parkway portfolio is mostly located in Houston. So they, I think we all remember when they were hit by Hurricane Harvey. It was a Category 4 hurricane that caused $125 billion in damages. We had already identified that those buildings were at high risk for flooding. So before the hurricane, they had already taken measures like installing floodgates and to protect some of the underground spaces. And we had a lot of dewatering pumps on site to make sure the building was prepared. And this is on the underground spaces. We also moved some of the critical equipment to higher ground. So even though they had those underground gates, it wasn't meant to stop all the water from coming in. They were okay to flood in some of those areas, and the dewatering pumps were like just removing water. Another interesting thing is that on the Parkway case, they also had site teams that stayed on site during the hurricane, and they were able to prevent a lot bigger issues from happening. And the beauty of this is that, even after it being hit by a major hurricane, the building had 0 insurance claims. And I think that's an important point to make even when you're negotiating insurance rates, is that if you take measures to prevent those risks, one, it's going to be a lot less costly than dealing with the issues afterwards, but you should also be able to negotiate lower insurance rates. You can go on the next one.
All right.
Yeah. So just to kind of, I think that to end, there's a lot of like regional and building level resilience solutions that are, kind of being set in motion right now. Like the top picture on the left is like Toronto, which is considered the most resilient city in the world. And you can see like how they have a lot of green space that allows the city to breathe and absorb excess water, and they're more higher density. And I mean, we know from US that we have a lot of sprawl, and we've put so much hardscape that we don't allow our cities to breathe. So it's really important that we incorporate those ways to deal with all the excess water. So there's a lot of projects on the city level to be able to kind of deal with that excess water. And I remember listening to the mayor of Puerto Rico when she was talking about, when they were hit by the hurricane, is that the water had nowhere to go. And the problem too is that a lot of that water was like contaminated with feces. And so it's really critical that the cities also plan more of those things that allow the city to breathe. Another important point is that even when our clients say, okay, I'm going to protect my area, so even if it floods 10 feet, I can still protect my property. But if the whole area floods, you're in an island situation, your building's still going to lose value because no one can access your property. So it's really important too, is that neither the private sector or the public sector are going to be able to solve this problem alone. So it's important to see like there's a lot of like important public partnerships taking place, like in places like New York or Boston. We need to see a lot more of that happening, where they're creating plans and proposals to protect the whole coastal area, which I think is kind of really where we need to be focusing on. So on the building level, we're also seeing a lot of things that just in terms of even transition risk. So obviously elevating your footprint. I mean, that's an easy one. That's like a solar power generator. We're seeing in places like San Francisco, where they pass regulatory requirements to, as we need to focus on also reducing our dependence on fossil fuels. Like cities are taking action to, for example, like some cities are banning natural gas from new buildings. So that is a transition risk because, you know, natural gas is a fossil fuel. So a lot of these kind of, as we try to transition to a low carbon economy, you know, the things that we need to think about as we're trying to adapt our buildings. One of the things in terms of the blackouts for PG&E, even when you put solar in your building, it's tied to the grid. So when you have a blackout, that building's going to shut down as well. So some of our buildings are looking at kind of not being as reliant on the grid and kind of being more independent. So they're looking at like microgrids and ways they can also like function and still have power independence from the grid and the big utilities. So I think it's just really important that we understand those transition risks and see how that's going to affect our properties. Even like one of those buildings is like local food production, which when you have those massive events, like entire crops can be damaged. So we're seeing more and more like, you know, places incorporating local food production. So there's a lot of different things that we're trying to do to adapt, or even like for disaster recovery, where we have those little pods where people can charge their phones, or even machines that can pull water from air and provide, you know, water when your whole water system might have been contaminated. So these are just to list some of those solutions. And I think the final point is that, you know, the estimated cost of meeting the 1.5 climate targets about 0.5 trillion over the next 30 years, but it will save the world $30 trillion in damages. So clearly, you know, taking action makes a lot of sense. And just even when we see California, we have the U.S. biggest clean energy and carbon reduction goals. We recently committed to going 100% renewable with the passage of SB 100. And we also have the faster economic growth than the U.S. national average. So that's really a proof that taking steps to fight climate change is not only good for the environment, but it's also good for business.
Great.
Thank you.
Sure. No, and that solar, whatever that is, the second picture down on the right, that thing's pretty cool.
It's a solar power generator.
Oh, nice. Okay, so this is perfect. So we're kind of approaching the 3/4 mark. And David, I want to bring you back into this conversation, see if there's any questions for Danielle or myself, or if others have. I saw a hand raise, I think, perhaps from somebody on the line.
Great, thank you. No, this was an excellent discussion, and we do see some questions coming in. While we sort through those, I had jotted down a couple of my own, if I may. So Dan, you know, you made a point, a really important one. You know, buildings are real assets. They're here for a long time, right? Designed to be, but ownership, you know, may be temporary, shorter term in nature, and some of these risks are really, you know, regional or citywide in nature. So I think that can bring up a question of like who really owns that risk. So I'm curious, you know, if there's interest, if you're seeing interest from members in the kinds of ideas around like public-private partnerships or, you know, policy interventions that could support some of the efforts that they may be undertaking at the building or portfolio level, but in the context of a regional risk.
Yeah, I think that those will start to wash out when it comes to the locational attributes when you build a portfolio of buildings. And, you know, there's a lot of factors that go into that. There's obviously the economy and the type of building it is, the growth in the industries there, and whether or not it's a basic industry. When it comes to risk factors, those, you know, these issues are becoming more and more important. And the whole notion that, oh, well, we can just insure it and insure it away and transfer the risk. Well, that's great, except insurance contracts are typically yearly. So if the knee-jerk reaction is to say, yeah, well, let's go build the next warehouse in say, Miami, obviously there's demand and need for that down there. And being able to insure it now, okay. But there may very well come a point in time where that gets pulled, and now you've taken on a whole bigger risk than you thought. Those are the issues that are on portfolio managers' minds.
Absolutely. A good question. I think maybe this one's for Danielle. If you could think about in LA, what are some of the typical scenarios that you plan for? Would that be like a seismic risk or wildfire leading to a grid outage? Could you give some examples of scenario planning for your LA clients?
Yeah. So I don't know that you're planning for a certain kind of earthquake level. And when we're talking about resilience and climate risk, it's more climate risk. So you're focusing more on sea level rise and hurricanes. But obviously, we know that if you're in California, earthquake is a risk. So we do prepare for that. So for example, like in some of our buildings where we do have those emergency plans in place, we do even do drills and make the whole building evacuate on an annual basis and tell them what to do in the case of different disasters or fires or hurricanes. Like for example, if you're in a high-rise building, right, your first reaction is to get out. And that's actually a very unsafe thing to do because there's a lot of risk from like broken glass falling on you and things coming on you. So it's really important that we do those kind of, do those scenario plannings with the building occupants so that you can address any potential misconceptions of what they think might be the safest thing to do in the case of different types of disasters, and making sure that you plan for that. Yeah, and fire is a tough one. And one of the things that we are seeing and hearing a lot in terms of fires or even any of those risks is that right now, depending on the magnitude of the risk, is that you can't, like the government or like the cities, they're just not equipped to deal with the magnitude of those clients. So we're seeing a lot of communities coming together and being the first responders, honestly. Like I've heard in LA, even in Malibu, where like the community were like, okay, I'll do a fire watch, you can go sleep, I'll keep an eye. And they all did fire training so that they could, and they were the ones that protected their houses and were able to kind of help the firefighters protect their homes and kind of as a community deal with some of those things. So I think that's important to understand, like to obviously at the building level, but at a community level, figure out what the resources are and that you're collaborating with the community to in the case where you need to be the first respondent on helping a neighbor evacuate from a situation where the public resources are stranded and they just can't get to everyone.
David, can I jump in? I want to go back to your public-private partnership comment or question. And cities that do a better job at that are going to be better positioned. And this is all about looking at economic risk, right? That's how investors think. So the communities that are addressing these things, that are putting in place resilience officers, that are taking action and thinking about it now, and I'm thinking specifically about, say, Boston, Washington, D.C. Obviously, I'm a little bit more East Coast oriented because that's where I live. Are going to be much better positioned than those that are playing ostrich. They'll just attract more capital. Yeah.
No, absolutely. I actually just jotted that down. I think that's a really key takeaway, is that cities that public-private partnership will do better in the long term. Dan, I wanted to go back to another point that you made just about what GRES does really, and applying structure to non-financial data. Danielle gave that great example of her client in Houston who, because they had properly planned and implemented a lot of the concepts that I think are encapsulated in the GRES resiliency framework, had no insurance claims when a lot of others did. Are you seeing interest from insurers in the kind of analysis that GRES is producing? I know some of them also invest in real estate, of course, but from an underwriting, perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. And because GRESB is removed from the asset level, obviously assets drive how an investment portfolio does. An investment portfolio is going to have multiple buildings in it. It's going to have rent contracts, and that's all going to flow up in cash flow to a portfolio and a portfolio result. but we are removed from, you know, actual building level kind of conversations. And as a result, our data is much more useful to institutional investors that want to put $100 million to work into a fund now being offered by, you know, one of our participants. And what it's really all from what we do with those institutional investors, it's for them trying to understand which companies are good asset managers, which companies are really good at focusing on risk, are good asset operators. And so when you get down to the building level and you see the Parkway example, you're like, wow, okay, this company has good systems in place. They're solid asset managers. They've got plans, and look what they were able to accomplish. No claims during Hurricane Harvey. Well, I would think that they've got a savvy, you know, whoever's in charge of the insurance, the asset manager for the insurance broker, he's going to go talk to whoever insures that building and say, hey, look, you know, we were 0 loss, and we expect that that's going to show up in our premium next year. That savings would accrue to the ultimate fund investor, and that's a big win. So that's how you kind of parse that to get to the root of your issue. The short answer is no, we don't have insurers that are knocking on the GRES door saying, hey, can we look at your data? But we do have institutional investors that are very interested in people's ability to manage risk.
Absolutely.
And David, I can add something to that point. So when we were doing our risk assessment, like criteria, we did, because we wanted to be able to, in the future, potentially negotiate lower insurance rates. We met with a lot of the top insurance companies. We met with like 4 of the top insurance companies in the country, and we kind of showed them kind of the different areas of risk that we were looking at, and said, okay, what are we missing here that would help you, you know, potentially consider doing a lower insurance rate for a company that's addressing some of those things. And the biggest feedback on their end was one, like, you know, fireproofing the building, making sure it was code compliant, like structurally, and so there's a lot of areas that they mentioned that would be helpful. And we did add a lot of different criteria because of feedback from insurance companies. The other thing that I heard from them is that the models that they currently use to kind of evaluate risks are totally outdated, and they're really just doing like applying like a formula to certain areas to evaluate risks when they're trying to kind of even price out their insurance rates. And they even said, oh my gosh, well, a tool like this would be super helpful for the insurance company to also evaluate the risks when they were, you know, trying to figure out so I think even the insurance company is kind of really needs to adapt and better understand those risks. And, but we did make some changes to incorporate some of their feedback and things that kind of it was more critical from their perspective to when we're doing those assessments.
That's a super helpful example, and I think that's kind of where I was going with that question is, you know, does this resiliency module or framework start to bubble up, you know, things that insurers should be thinking about that maybe they haven't been in the past, you know, that as they look to the future, what are the risk factors and what are the indicators, you know, good GRES scores being a great one of, you know, operator ability to manage those risks. Of course, getting down to the asset level is site specific. I want to be mindful of time. We've got just a minute left, so if I could get a quick response to what I know is a big topic. Electrification is a big topic. New York or decarbonization. New York recently passed their law. LA is considering something similar. I wouldn't be surprised to see it popping up in other cities soon. But of course, you know, the more we rely on electricity, the more we're relying on the electricity grid. I wonder if either of you, open question, wanted to quickly comment on that.
Sure.
Danielle, maybe you had any clients, or Dan.
Well, let me go quick because I can actually see Joe's question. I'm not sure if Danielle can. So
I can see it. Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay, so you know, look, diversification is a great idea, and totally get it on the single fuel source. The you know, being resilient means honestly taking a lot of things that you depend on externally and internalizing them. So Danielle was making points about going off the grid and not being grid reliant. And that's, I mean, that's my knee-jerk answer to Joe's point here. Danielle, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yes, I mean, that's a good point. But even if you're building, you know, it's more reliant on electricity versus things like natural gas, there's still multiple sources that you can generate the electricity, whether it's coming from wind power or solar power, and a source that's not creating other like external issues like fracking, which it's polluting our very limited water supply. So yes, it can be, but I think that's also like when you see California where you have community choice aggregation programs, we're moving toward where we are totally 100% reliant on the grid, where we're coming up with more options where you can also try to generate your own electricity. And I think, yeah, there was a recent, like the Port of Long Beach, for example, where they are working on a microgrid. And, you know, if you have data centers or different types of buildings that really have to stay in operation in the issue of a disaster, they are looking at those solutions. And, you know, and even if they're full electric, how can they be able to kind of stay in operation in those disasters? But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. That's something we'll have to address. But I think overall, the risks that we are having those disasters because of all our kind of, you know, partially because of greenhouse gas and carbon emissions. And I do think that we need to move away from fossil fuels and things that are helping to cause those problems.
David, it looks like we've got a whole bunch of participants that have given us a couple extra minutes of time here. That's awesome. Thanks so much for having us. I'll turn back to you.
Great. Well, thank you both. I think this is a good place to conclude. I really enjoyed the dialogue, the discussion, and appreciate both of your time and everybody taking time out of your afternoon to tune in. Do look out for the slides and the recording, as well as some key takeaways. Any other questions, feel free to reach out to us, and as always, appreciate your feedback. So with that, thank you, everybody. We'll see you next month.